Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is, Gideon, we're going to be hearing that name mentioned more and more as time goes on. It's going to come to a point later on we're going to be identifying him primarily as Jerubbaal and not as Gideon. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod, or Harod, I don't know how you pronounce that. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Morah. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands. In order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her, announce now to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. That was actually part of the Moses law. Let's see if I can find it. Deuteronomy 12, maybe? No. It's a place of worship. Deuteronomy 17, maybe? That's about the king and the law courts. Deuteronomy 20. Deuteronomy 20 talks about the rules of going to war. And in verse 5, they start giving exceptions. They start giving rules for when certain men should get exemptions from having to go to war. Anyone built a new house, not dedicated it, let him go home. Anyone planted a vineyard, let him go home. Anyone become pledged to a woman, not married her, let him go home. Then in verse 8, Deuteronomy 20, verse 8, then the officers shall add, is any man afraid or faint-hearted? Let him go home, so that his brothers will not become disheartened too. So, making exceptions for those who are faint-hearted was permitted in the law of Moses. God himself is reminding them of this here. If any of these guys are not really cut out for this, cut them loose, send them away. They don't need to be here. So there were 32,000. There were 22,000 such men, and now there's 10,000 left. This is another thing, this whole section here, I know I've kind of picked on a certain masculine mindset, which probably reads the book of Judges with more excitement than it really calls for. And I think that's true, okay? I think I've heard, over my 40 years, I've heard a number of sermons and lessons and read a number of written books and lessons and materials on Judges that I think doesn't really capture the spirit of the book of Judges and what the author of Judges or the authors were trying to communicate with this book. And I do think that a lot of that does come down to, so much of our preaching and so much of our teaching, so much of our instruction comes from men and comes from a certain kind of man, certain kind of philosophy and mindset and point of view that I think really gets excited about this sort of thing. I think a lot of preachers, for example, feel like persecuted, beings, like the world's out to get them. And so I think that the idea of like going to fight against the enemy, against overwhelming odds, just really, really warms the bellies of a lot of guys who speak about the book of Judges. And I think that this is another example. I think Gideon, for example, is highlighted because this story of him going to battle with 300 guys and winning against an army of, where does it say, 100,000 or something like that, or whatever, however many. We'll read the number later. Like that excites certain men. Like there's a certain type of, I think, predominantly male personality that just really, really gets excited by that. Now they would never want to do this themselves. Okay, it's like they don't actually want to. Gideon didn't want to be Gideon. It's like Gideon did not want to be Gideon. He's constantly trying to back out, make it like Moses did. Even more so than Moses, Gideon is trying to back out and shy away from his duties. And when he finally gets, even now, the Spirit of the Lord is on him, and he still needs signs. He still is timid. And I think that it's understandable to me. I would be one of those 22,000 men who were there and then left. Okay? If I even stood up, I want to admit, I'm not cut out for this sort of thing. All right? If I were there at all, ever had been there at all, I'd be that 22,000 men who were there and then left. That's what I would be. I'm not even going to pretend that I'd be anything else. But I think that there's a lot of guys out there who like the idea of being Gideon and going to war and doing this sort of impossible thing with the help. Now, Gideon will forget that God did this for him, by the way. As we read through this, he's going to more and more take credit for this victory himself as time goes on. So his priorities get messed up. But I think there's just a lot of guys out there who just like this kind of story and like imagining themselves as Gideon. And so, as I said before, I think that there's a certain kind of personality that reads the book of Judges, and I think probably takes the wrong message away from it. But those are the kinds of dudes who primarily are giving the sermons and writing the books and teaching the lessons about Judges. So we get a lot of that. You read a lot of books about Judges, and that's the perspective you're going to read about. That's the perspective it's going to be written from to a large degree, but I don't really think that's accurate. Anyway, moving on. So they got 10,000. Had 32,000, now they got 10,000. But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will sift them for you. And remember, they're at a spring. If I say, this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues, like a dog, lap the waters with their tongues like a dog, from those who kneel down to drink. Now, dogs were bad creatures in Israel. And we're not really talking about like household pet type dogs. We're talking about like jackals and wolves and things like that roamed in packs and scavenged. That's what an Israelite mind is thinking of when he thinks of dogs. Consistently throughout the Bible, dogs are going to be used as an imagery of a very bad kind of person. In the New Testament, they're going to call the Gentiles dogs. That's just, dogs are not adorable. They were not man's best friend in Israel. They were not adorable, friendly, cuddly creatures in Israel. So comparing someone to a dog already tells you that that's not the kind of person we want left standing in this army. 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. Now, this is a very funny way of explaining this. Okay, I don't know what the translation, exactly how to parse through the Old Hebrew. But basically, there's two kinds of, here's what's going on here. You've got 10,000 dudes who I guess are all lining up to take their turn to drink out of the spring. And all but 300 of them are getting down on all fours and doing that to lap up the water like with their tongue. I have cats. Cats think the same way dogs do. Of course, cats don't have arms. They only have legs like dogs. So when they bend down to drink, they'll go down and they'll do that. Okay? That's what these guys are doing. Then there's 300, of that 9,700 of those 10,000 men are doing that. They're getting down on all fours like a dog and lapping it up with their tongues. There are 300 of them who are scooping the water up with their hands and bringing it to their mouths. There are only 300 of them who are doing that. Those are the guys that we're going to keep. I'm thinking, the text doesn't say, but I'm thinking the idea is that because those guys are leaving their hands free, like they're not putting themselves in as vulnerable a position. If you're getting down on all fours and leaning over and doing that, you're leaving yourself in a vulnerable position, in a more vulnerable position. If you're bending down and scooping the, maybe only even with one hand. Maybe you still got your sword arm free. Maybe you're still holding your sword in your right hand, and you're scooping the water up with your palm and licking it that way. Those are the 300 that they're keeping. I'm thinking that's supposed to mean they're more battle ready. It's like I said, they might even be doing it with just one hand and keeping their sword in their other hand. Okay, so these are the guys that we're going to actually keep in the army. The ones who are getting down on all fours and lapping it up like a dog are the ones that are going to be cut loose. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you, and give the Midianites into your hands. Let the other men go. Let all the other men go, each to his own place." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites to their tents, but kept the 300, who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack," which he's still afraid to attack, "go down to the camp with your servant Purah, and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you'll be encouraged to attack the camp." Gideon was still afraid to attack the camp. You know how I know that? Because he's going to do what God said to do if he was still afraid to attack the camp. So he and Purah, with his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp. So he was still afraid to attack the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." So they know it. They know it more than Gideon does. Gideon only finally finds his true faith and courage when he realizes the enemy is shaking in their boots at the thought of his name. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped God. That's what it finally took. It finally took the enemy, him hearing out loud the enemies of God, talking about how God's going to give them over to him. That's what finally did it for him. Excuse me. There's something else I wanted to say. Well, hopefully if there is, it'll come to me at some point. Oh, yes. These Midianites, of course, Gideon had an army of 32,000, all right? And these Midianites would have known about that. All right, so Gideon, let's see here. At the beginning of chapter 7, it says, "Early in the morning, Jerubbaal," that is Gideon, "and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moab." So these Midianites would have known they were there. They had come at in chapter 6, verse 33, it says, "They all came across the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel." So now Gideon is going with an army of 32,000 to meet them. So these Midianites know the Israelites are going to fight them this time. They've been coming in and out for the last 7 years, apparently with no opposition, or at least very little or weak opposition. Now they're going to actually have a fight. The Israelites are not going to be taking this without a fight any longer. So they knew that they were going to have to do a battle with the Israelites. And I guess they also apparently knew that a guy named Gideon was going to be at the head of the army. So anyway, back to where we were. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped God. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, I'm guessing 100 apiece, He placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them, with torches inside. These are the stuff that he would have gotten from the guys who left, of course. We said back in verse 8 that these 300 took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. So they have a trumpet in one hand, and they're holding an empty jar in the other, well, a jar in the other, and they have a torch inside. It's not totally empty because there's a torch inside the jar. But they're not carrying any weapons. I mean, like, their hands are occupied now. They got a trumpet and a jar with a torch in it in their hands. They don't have a room for a sword right now. Watch me, he told them. Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. Yeah. That's what's important here, for Gideon. Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. Midnight, I guess? I don't really know. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. So they had these empty jars. These would have been clay pots or something. And I guess they would have smashed them to the ground at that point. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. We just got done reading that. Another example of how they often state the same thing more than once in these narratives. Again, I think that this goes back to that ancient Hebrew concept of parallelism, saying 2 things in a row, or saying something and then saying something else to make a point about the first thing you said, or whatever like that. And I think that's a narrative form of that concept of speaking like twice. And I believe it all goes back to the idea that they thought in circles. Their ancient minds, they didn't necessarily see history as a straight line running across from start to finish. They saw history as a series of circles, kind of tumbling forward endlessly forever. And I think you can see that reflected in their writing, where a lot of times, like here, they will say the exact same thing 2 times in a row. Or they'll say it, and they'll say it again, like kind of backwards. They'll say something one way, and then go around and say the exact same thing the other way the next time. Here's another. We've been seeing this since the beginning of Genesis, and here it is again. So they blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. So they're confusing the Midianites. They have spread around the camp, where they each have a trumpet and they each have a torch, and they're blowing the trumpets and they're flashing the torches, and they're making the Midianites think that there is a huge army surrounding them. And the Midianites, as far as the Midianites know, there's at least 30,000 Israelites ready to attack them, and they think that's what's happening. They think these 30,000 Israelites are moving in on them in the middle of the night, but it's not. But they're confused now. Well, when the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. So they can't see. It's dark. The Israelites are having their torches, but then the camp is dark, and they don't know what's going on. They don't know who's who. They don't know who's where. So they're attacking each other. They're fighting each other. The army fled to Beth Shittah toward Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Mahalah near Tabbath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. I'm assuming that this was the army they originally sent home. He said back in chapter 6, verse 35, he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. So here is Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh. Not Zebulun, though, for some reason. I'm assuming this is just basically the same guys that we just got done sending home, but I don't really know. But it makes sense. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim. So now he's sending for help from Ephraim too, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah." That will help cut off their route of escape. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they took the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth-barah. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. So this is still not a completely unified Israelite army. And even now that we've expanded the scope again beyond just these 300 to other tribes, probably mostly the same army we already had, but we're still only getting soldiers from Naphtali, Asher, Manasseh. We called ahead to Ephraim to help cut off the Midianites' route of escape. But this isn't the entire country. This is only a part of it.